Hi, I'm Chaz Kangas with GoRadioMN.com, and I am here with the great David Harbour. David, how you doing today?
I'm good, how are you?
Spectacular.
Good.
So I've been reading a few of the interviews leading up to season 3 dropping on Netflix, July 4th this year.
I'm sorry for you.
Oh, no, they're a feel-good hit of the summer. So one thing that you mentioned in a few of the interviews is when you got the script for the original episode of Stranger Things.
The pilot?
Yep, the pilot. And you thought there was so much great character evolution and story evolution on each and every page. Things are moving forward, and that's what really drew you to it. But you also had the thought that something like that in the first season would just be a cult success. When was the moment you realized what a phenomenon Stranger Things has become?
It was the weekend that it came out. I mean, I've done a lot of work throughout the years. Like, I've been acting since I was, in movies and TV for about 15 years, almost 20 years. And so every time something comes out, there'll be like a couple people that'll text me, sometimes more than a couple, but, and then this thing came out, and I remember my phone lit up with like 100 text messages from people who, you randomly get somebody's number, an old friend from high school or something like 10 years ago, and you like never use it. And it's just, my phone just like lit up with all these things saying just like Stranger Things, oh my God. And I'd never experienced anything like that. And then the BuzzFeed article started coming out, like what kind of Stranger Things character are you, or like those things. And I was like, wow, this has really struck a chord with a lot of people. And it was very, very gratifying because there wasn't a lot of hype, there wasn't a lot of advertising. It was just that people discovered the show. And we put like all our heart into it. So it's very gratifying when you risk that much and when you pour that much into something and people really feel it and really respond to it. It was very, very gratifying.
Yeah, and it's one of those shows where the word of mouth that summer, it became just the topic of so much conversation, and just the way it resonates with people, whether the nostalgia was a window in, whether it was just the fact that it was a real community sort of show to have people just go through, and the movement of that is just tremendous.
Yeah.
And so now we're on season 3.
We are.
And when you mentioned in a few of the other interviews how it's not so much often about when you're filming it, the feeling of like you're being transported in another time. Like, it's not really about it being the 80s for you so much as an actor about getting in the mentality of men in the 80s. And so what do you think is the biggest difference between getting in the head of a man in the 80s versus like modern day?
That's interesting. I mean, Hopper is a product of his time. He's also a product of what we went through in this country. He's someone who was born in 1940. So, because I age with him. So he's 45 in 1985. So he went to Vietnam, and he was in New York as a cop in the 70s. And so all those things kind of factor into his views of life, his PTSD, his depression, his love of country, his love of his Midwestern town that he grew up in. He lives a very different life than I do. And so in that way, my whole family's from Houston, and my sort of my genealogy is a lot from Houston. And so, I use a lot of that stuff. I use a lot of stuff that, like my grandfather, my uncle's down there. So it's sort of a combination of all these things. I do think, he tends to have these rougher edges than lead characters of today does. Like, he clearly has, he's homophobic in certain ways. Like, and I think that's one of the interesting things about the show, is to go back and to have this like heavily, he's angry at children and women and all sorts of people. So like, to have this sort of throwback character really start to develop and learn throughout the show is one of the enlightening and fun things to play. And to go back and to have sort of that strong, almost boorish masculinity, but amidst sort of the reality of like strong female characters, like Joyce, who doesn't need a guy like Hopper, who goes and gets her own damn axe to like chop a wall and the thing, and for Hopper to have to keep up with that, but still have this rugged, masculinity thing, I think is a really fun thing to play with, that we play with in the series. But I like his rough edges. I mean, when I was a kid, I remember my grandmother. This is something that we don't really, support anymore so much. But I remember my grandma. I was 5 years old and I got stung by a bee or something, and I cried, and she like knocked me around, not in a bad way, and said like, boys don't cry. And so I grew up with this sort of boys don't cry thing, which I really have a lot of respect for and a lot of sort of nostalgia for myself, because we live in a very different culture today. But there's something about the tradition of that, rugged cowboy thing that I just have a soft spot in my heart for, and I just have a love for. So, that all fuels my characterization of him as well.
And in that same vein, with the characterization, there's been only 2 things you've revealed about this coming season. One is that episode 8, you say, is the most beautiful thing you've ever filmed.
Yeah.
And the other being, we can look forward to your mustache this season too.
I don't know if you can look forward to it, but you're going to be confronted with it.
Hey, that's what
You've
life's
gotta
about.
Deal with it.
Yeah, that's what growth's about, and then,
It's true.
Yeah.
I'm going to stretch your heart.
Yeah, it's about not crying in the face of mustaches. So was something like the mustache a specific choice on your part than for the character?
Absolutely.
Nice.
I mean, the fun thing about it is 1985 television, Magnum PI is really big. And there's also tons of movies with like Burt Reynolds and different. The mustache was big in general, but in terms of our subconscious response to television, I feel like art imitates life, imitates art, imitates life, imitates art, and we're always going back and forth. So I feel like there is something, especially in that time when network television was such a staple. Like you'd go home at 8 o'clock and just turn on the TV, especially if you're some kind of single dad who's struggling with their daughter growing up and you want to shut it down. You just eat a bunch of chips and sit in front of the television and stew, which Hopper does a lot of. And I think subconsciously you respond to those images and those choices. And there is a sense this season that Hopper wants to break out of this depression and is struggling very chaotically to be a man again in a way that he hasn't. And I think he doesn't know that he's mimicking Magnum PI in a certain way, but he just, because of the subconscious, feeding of that, he's just like, yeah, I don't know. I think I'd look good in a mustache, and it just like sort of happens. And so I really like playing with that concept of, like television in general, what a powerful medium it was. Now I don't know what you call television, because like we're theoretically a television show, but we're kind of a web series. Who knows what Netflix is? But back then, television was this powerful, sort of cool medium that would just like influence our interactions and our phrases and like how we behaved. And so I wanted to do some of that with this show. And also, it's just like fun in the 80s to have a cop with a mustache. I mean, it's just like perfect.
It's the ideal situation, the perfect storm.
Yeah, exactly.
So, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, and then finally, since you mentioned with the changing times and with television being so, especially with the summer of '85, the huge rollout and influx of cable television and the shifting there, whereas today you have something like Stranger Things on Netflix, which was originally, a service, mailing out the DVDs, and now it's become the forefront and leader in original content. Do you recall the first thing you ever watched via Netflix? Whether
Via
it was
Netflix?
Yeah, whether it was like a
Wow.
disc being sent in the mail.
Yeah,
or-
totally. I mean, I remember, God, how long ago was it? It was like,
I couldn't have been in comp, but I would get DVDs sent to me. Like that was the big thing, is they'd send you 3 DVDs and you could return them anytime you wanted, right? It wasn't like Blockbuster where they charge you $3 a day for late rentals. Can you imagine that? I remember I got so busted by Blockbuster. Like I had a tape out and I just never returned it. And then they would have like occasional amnesty days or something where they'd be like, just round up. But I ruined my relationship with Blockbuster so much.
Yeah, and then heaven forbid you returned it without being rewound. Like
I
then
know,
that
right?
follows you forever.
Oh man, they even made those like rewinder things. But I do not remember what the first movie I watched from Netflix was. I do not remember, but it was the DVD generation.
Yeah, wonderful. Once again, thank you so much
Thanks,
today.
man.
This has been tremendous.
That was fun.
Thanks.